Well, welcome everyone. My name's Philip Relf. Welcome to this education series. And I also welcome a colleague of mine, Christopher. How are you going?
Good. How are you doing, Philip?
Very well, thank you. I'm really excited about today, actually. I see this as, the title of the webinar is Cracking the Code of Organisational Learning. And I think so many organisations are really challenged by this. And I know the organisations you and I work with are constantly trying to work out how to more effectively train and develop their people. So I'm really looking forward to sharing a whole lot of really high value information with people on the call today, and also those who will be watching this webinar recording going forward. What I thought I'd do before we introduce ourselves properly was really just have a look at what we're going to actually cover today. So we're really going to be looking at some of the traps and pitfalls around organisational learning, as I was just alluding to. And boy, there are plenty. Then what does learning look like in the future? And we've got kind of a top 10 list that we're going to go through, and that's based on really 2 decades of working in this field of training and development, and really supporting a whole range of different organisations. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And then finally, we're going to talk about a platform which for us, it's not the panacea, and we're not suggesting that's a panacea, but to be transparent around this, you're the strategic business coach for Actionable in Australia. I'm an accredited practitioner, and we will be introducing that as a possible platform for organisations. So just to be completely upfront there, we don't think it's the whole solution, but obviously it's we think it's a very powerful way to really develop people every day. In fact, in my 2 decades, I think it's one of the most exciting initiatives and platforms that I've seen. So anyway, I reckon it might be a good time, Christopher, just to draw a breath and introduce yourself to the good folks on the call at the moment. We've got a whole lot of people from around the country and also different locations. But tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll do the same.
Great. Well, you may have picked up on an accent pretty quickly. I'm actually based in Sydney, Australia, but actually come from Boston, Massachusetts, over in America, and have been living here for 8 years, and definitely consider it home. But my background is actually in education. So I started out as a teacher myself and got my master's in education, and then very much wanted to use that skill set in a fairly different space. So went and worked for a high-end residential real estate organization in New York City, which was quite an interesting experience, and then moved into a retail organization called Lululemon Athletica, which is a Canadian company that really focuses on yoga and athletic wear. And I was doing a lot of training around Australia and New Zealand, and then had an opportunity to join a learning and development company. So spent the last 5 years before joining Actionable really focusing on young professionals, early managers, and even leaders, really looking at the professional skills that can have them kind of moving up that staircase of leading self, to leading others, to eventually leading teams, business units, and even organizations. So
fantastic.
When I entered Actionable, I really was curious about this idea of sustaining and measuring learning. And I know we'll talk a lot about that over the next roughly hour. But really what I have been striving for over the last 5 years, and continue to really focus my energy on.
Fantastic, thank you. Boston is a beautiful part of the world. I was lucky enough to go there in 2010 and spent some time at Harvard and breathed in the fumes of Harvard, which is a wonderful experience. I just wanted to go there to attend Harvard, not just the 2 weeks of learning that I soaked up. But yeah, beautiful part of the world.
Yeah, I don't miss the snow involved, but it is a fabulous city.
Yeah. Okay, so a bit about myself just quickly. So I'm in Melbourne today and based in Melbourne. And for the folks on the call, also I started my own practice 11 years ago now, or we're in our 11th year, and really working very exclusively in the leadership and team development space with a lot of medium to large companies, some small companies, but mainly those in the Australian Stock Exchange top 100, really supporting them to develop more effective leaders and have high-performing, healthy teams. So that's my focus and my team's focus. Before that, I was with ANZ Bank, and for those non-Australian people, that's one of the, or those people not based in Australia, one of the top 4 banks in Australia. It's about 40,000 people, 45 countries, where I led three teams around consulting and program delivery for a very large culture change project, which for me probably still one of the highlights of my career, working in that environment and that context. And you know, we had people like John Cotter come over from Harvard and do a case study on our program, and said it was probably one of the most significant change case studies he'd seen in 10 years. So, you know, I guess we did something right. So it's just an amazing experience. And before that, I was actually with government and Victoria Police for many years, where I really picked up a lot of my facilitation and coaching skills in some pretty tough environments, you know, I have to say, particularly around leadership, communication, and conflict resolution. So, yeah, I guess we both bring pretty different backgrounds to it.
Yeah, definitely. I think the varied backgrounds, in my experience, has always really led to I guess powerful engagement in the L&D space. Coming at it from very different angles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the good thing about it, isn't it? That more eclectic nature, you can bring a whole lot of different experience to it, supported by, of course, you know, the research and some of the kind of programs that we do ourselves. So, okay, so shall we start? I thought it might be a nice place just to start with the actual challenge. And you know, we both consult to organisations and have consulted for some time. But some of the things I see is that, you know, the learning and development industry worldwide is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So it has it's, you know, high cost, but high rewards also if you get it right. What I see though, a lot of organisations are struggling with how do we more effectively, you know, develop people in this day and age when, you know, budgets are tight, time is tight, people's skill sets often have to be quite adaptable, and that the environment is changing so quickly that we might develop someone for this particular skill set here, and before we know it, they require a different skill set. And I think that's particularly true of leadership. You know, while there's some core skills that we all need as leaders, we also need to be constantly connecting those to what the environment and the organisation and the strategy requires. And we also know, though, that even though it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, that a lot of the training is just ineffective. And in fact, some of the data we'll look at today suggests that maybe 1 in 5 people who attend non-technical training, so we're not talking about Excel spreadsheets here, non-technical training will probably not really sustain the behaviour change or create the behaviour change they need to. So that's a bit of a problem. You know, organisations are spending a lot of money and not necessarily getting a return on investment, which, you know, is my passion. I know, Christopher, you really care about that as well. So I thought I'd just, you know, maybe more of a conversational style kind of check in with you. And what do you see as some of the key challenges today around learning and development?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for me is organizations finding themselves in a situation where they're really looking at one mode of learning or one offering as the complete L&D offering for their employees and their pool of potentially young starters all the way through senior leaders. And you know, sometimes that we'll see them having formalized programs. But very often you find people in a bit of a void where they don't have anything to turn to other than potentially an e-learning solution or a single day here and there in a face-to-face environment. And I think it's a big challenge to try to figure out what mixture of different modalities and mediums we can deliver to employees to really give them a huge amount of opportunity, but also that engagement that will lead them to be retained in your organization for longer and be more passionate about your strategic vision and fulfilling on your mission.
Yeah, you make a great point. I see some organisations, you know, the pendulum was over here in terms of formal workplace classroom learning, and it's almost like it's swung too far the other way, where they try and, you mentioned e-learning or what have you, where they're trying to move away from classroom-based learning too much. It's almost like, give us microbytes, and we hear, or learning bytes. We hear a lot of different kind of terminology, and again, that's good, but it doesn't necessarily replace some of the other more substantial, robust learning. So it probably feels like it's got to be, there's a whole kind of continuum of learning, isn't there? It's not kind of one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Even in the last few years, I've been across a lot of organizations. I'm sure you have as well, that have said, you know what, we're thinking about just instituting e-learning, and I think in their mind that's a solution that's really going to fulfill the needs of their employees and their business. And what I worry about is typical e-learning is something that was innovative, 15 years ago. 20
Yeah,
years ago
exactly.
even. And so going back there is not a full solution. It by all means can form a part of a solution that can offer people the ability to drive their own development, but it has to be paired with potentially face-to-face learning or some kind of technology that will allow them to engage with other people while they digest content and really think about how that applies to their role and responsibilities.
Yeah. I mean, I was sharing this offline with you, but I'll share it now without using the name of the university. But a very prestigious global university, a friend of mine works there, and they have this online program. And what he says is that they get tens of thousands of people enrolling every year, but the completion rate is 5%. And so, what's happening to that other 95%? People are being enthused, engaged by the promise of learning and the promise of something different. And then their experience, whilst there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the course, it's the scaffolding isn't there, the kind of support mechanisms aren't there, the community isn't there. So we know how important being part of a tribe is to learning. It's kind of hard to be an individual learner. Would you agree, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's so much noise out there, and that's both in our social lives, but also our professional lives, that to be a sole learner and go about driving your own development day in, day out is a tough slog, to use a bit of a common term. But I think it's a really hard journey to move through and get a lot of benefit from. So I think the ability to even have someone else to partner with and hold you accountable and bounce ideas off of is great. But we grow. I guess the output grows exponentially with a team or even a larger cohort of individuals that are going through a common experience together.
Yeah, yeah. I think sometimes, we know quite a lot about the science of learning, but do we actually implement that in organisations? Because we know that, being part of a tribe or a community is really important. As you say, there's some people who can learn, really well individually, but they're probably in the minority, and it's probably not a long-term sustainable kind of solution where you have just people sitting in front of a computer screen. It's great for technical training. It's great for onboarding. It's great for safety. There's a whole range of things that you can kind of use that mechanism for, but again, it doesn't replace other solutions as well, does it? It's kind of, there's a big fat and, sitting right in the middle there, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's a time and place, and we just have to understand what that time and place is.
Yeah. Any other challenges you see, or things that you see organisations, fundamentally struggling with, or maybe just approaching in the wrong way?
Yeah, I think the final piece of I guess this conversation in my mind is the idea of measurement. I think that with that pendulum swing from face-to-face learning to e-learning or an online solution, a lot of that is tied to budget constraints, and doing more with less is a term I have heard a lot in my consulting. And I understand that from a business perspective. I get why businesses go down that direction. But we also have to understand that without a clear return on investment or measure that gives us an idea of what that return on investment may be, it's really difficult to understand if we're making an impact, if we're if we're going in the right direction for not only our individual employees, but also our teams and most importantly, the organization as a whole.
Yeah. So that's a great point. Measurement is so important, isn't it? It's kind of almost the holy grail of learning and development. You know, when even we talk about culture and culture change, how do we actually measure that? And you know, there's tons of models out there, 4-layer models and multi kind of faceted approaches, but it's still hard, right? Because it's not like you're measuring how many widgets did we sell today. It's a little more amorphic and softer than that. So we just do our best and apply the most rigorous kind of models we have to try and see if there's a return on investment, I guess.
Yeah, that's to me the pinnacle of L&D is if we're able to really clearly understand through whatever measurement we have at our disposal whether we are moving the needle in the right direction. And as you said, it's a very tough code to crack if we're going to go back to the title of the webinar.
Yeah. And the other thing I see that we maybe not have touched on also is the role of the leader. So I remember talking to an organisation just in the last month, in fact, about this, where we were doing some work with a national team, and whilst the actual program components were going really well, the uptake was pretty good, but the kind of OD, organisational development, and L&D guy was saying, what else can we do internally? And I was kind of asking about what the head of the area was actually doing, and he had to admit that the head of the area was not doing much at all. And I said, well, we can only do so much on the outside, but it's actually got to be an internal conversation. It's got to be internally driven, and it's got to be driven by people who have authority, people who have the mechanisms, maybe the skills, hopefully, and the authority to kind of create a container for learning. If you ask consultants like us to come in and run particular kind of workshops or training, and then we leave, and then nothing happens, yes, there's some individual responsibility there, but the role of the leader is critical, don't you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I know we're going to look at the 70-20-10 model in a little while, and I think that's a really good representation of the challenge that I've been faced with. I know you have as well, in terms of, again, really focusing on some kind of learning intervention, whether that's online or face-to-face, and not having that 10% of learning transfer into the 20% that's really around coaching and mentoring, and definitely not the 70% of on-the-job learning. So it's a really tough barrier to crack, and I think a big piece is the known value of technical skills that managers see, and the kind of unknown or softer value professional skills offer. So I think that for me, in my time, I've really focused my consultancy and my training on professional skills, not necessarily the more technical side of the business. And that's an even harder one to measure. So leaders are crucial.
Yeah, and I think if we kind of go forward, I've got a couple of slides here before we throw back to yourself. But for me, sometimes I wonder how much we've kind of covered, or how much progress we've made in terms of being effective in our management and leadership style. And I write about this in my first book. I'm not trying to plug my book, but I've almost got a whole chapter. I've almost got a whole chapter in there about this notion of the industrial age paradigm, where the industrial age paradigm was fantastic for cranking out hundreds of cars and controlling things and setting up processes and protocols. And in a way, sometimes I wonder how much we've actually progressed in how we manage and lead people. Sometimes it feels very archaic. Do we really trust people sufficiently well to do the work that they need to do? So it kind of feels like we're driving a Porsche, but in my mind, sometimes it feels like we're driving one of these things, right? We really haven't progressed as much as we like. I had a different national OD manager ask me this question only a few months ago. She said, what's your assessment, nationally and internationally on leadership? Where do you think we're at? And I said, I think we just haven't progressed as far as we pretend we have. And that's not to say there's not pockets of excellence in organisations either. There are some great people out there, great leaders doing the best they can. I think sometimes we're kind of caught up in this context that what a great manager and leader is I can control widgets better than you can. And it's about efficiency versus actually about getting the best from people, which for me is quite different. Agree with that, I'm presuming?
Yeah. No, my nod is very much I concur. Yeah.
And so sometimes I think we kind of train in that way as well. And we talked about this before, but the hard cold facts is that most training or a lot of training doesn't work. And again, this is not to be critical of the industry, although sometimes I think we should be more critical of ourselves. But I think the reality is that we create training programs and workshops, but do we actually create people or set up people for success? Do we put the mechanisms in place for people to continue to learn? I think our job is definitely not done once a workshop is conducted. For example, if we kind of wring our hands or wipe our hands and say, didn't we do a great job, and then don't check in sometime later to see what the application of that learning has been, we probably haven't done a really good job.
Yeah,
so it's interesting.
I definitely agree.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that I've been in countless workshops where you cover 4 or 5 topics through the day and then take 20 minutes at the end of the day to say, well, now I want you to think about how this applies to your work and your role. And to think that 20 minutes is going to embed all of that content and all of that learning into somebody's day-to-day is a really it's far from reality, I would say.
Absolutely. So I mentioned a figure or a statistic, similar to this, but at the start of this conversation, but more than 75% report being happy with the training they receive. So they're usually disparagingly called the happy sheets, and that's one measure. It's good to measure mood and climate and tone at the end of a program, but of course the more important measure is what do they actually do with that. And so again, the data suggests that there's actually zero correlation between people being happy with the training and them applying the learnings, and therefore the performance, which again is a whole another level. And I think that's probably where we don't measure enough. You mentioned the 70-20-10 model, and this is absolutely the holy grail. And for those who haven't seen it before, I think you went through it quickly, Christopher, but that the 10% really is that formal learning, the workshops, the things we're doing in the formal sense, and then 20% is learning from others, whether that be kind of coaching or mentoring or significant others, and then 70% is in the workplace. What we do at our desk basically, and how people provide feedback for us and how they provide guidance and coaching on the job, in the job. And we know that often people look to the 10% for the panacea. And really, that's just not going to cut it. So this model is useful. It's been around for a long time. It came from some research that a company called CCL did about 3 decades ago. I'm not sure it's overly valid or robust, but you know what? It doesn't matter, because at least it pushes people, into a different way of thinking about how we actually learn effectively, and we just can't rely on that 10% of formal classroom training. All right. So I think it's time for our top 10. Christopher, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think the top 10 is needed to bring this from challenge to where we're actually going.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk through now. So the first one, for us, for those listening, there's lots of great comments coming through as well, but a solid context. So the development needs to occur within the context of the business strategy and the market, whether you're a for-profit, even a not-for-profit. And one of the things I really took from, my Harvard experience, for example, was Ron Heifetz, who's probably been more influential in how I think about leadership than any other, leadership guru, if you like, talks about outside-in leadership. And what he meant by that was that we actually have to be really mindful and cognizant of what's happening externally first, and then come back into the strategy, the organisation, and then your leadership capability, and therefore what does leadership look like in this organisation. And so when people say, you know, what does great leadership look like, I always ask, in what context? And so we know people like, so Winston Churchill was a great wartime leader, but in peacetime he was a poor leader and quite inadequate. He was seen as too aggressive and wasn't a good peacetime leader. So, you know, in what context? So set the context is really important, first of all. Just in time and strategic. So again, we can have a long-term view of our training agenda and calendar and what we want to achieve. And we need to be able to support people almost in the moment. So I know I do this, and I know you do, Christopher, as well, but so people might be moving into, say, a performance conversation cycle, and we're hoping that's not a yearly thing now. Hopefully we've mostly dispensed with that very old model of once a year I'm going to get together with my direct reports for an hour. Hopefully that's mostly gone now. But even if it's monthly or a 6-month review, that you actually, you know, provide some training, just-in-time training immediately before that review time, so it's fresh in people's minds and managers can go and do the best job possible. So I think that's you know, really useful to think about.
Yeah, and what struck me with number two is an experience I had in with one of the biggest banks in the world in London, there to run a 2-day leadership program, and the day before the program was supposed to start, the bank was plastered over the news, and not in a positive sense, and so clearly the learning had to change. We had to meet the participants in the room, in the place that they were in on that day. And I think that's something that learning and development professionals around the world do from time to time, but we all need to really understand where exactly are these people we're coming in to teach and to develop. I think it's critical.
Yeah, maybe getting off the track slightly, but often people also ask me about capability models, and you know, I think they have a place, but the downside, of course, is they can be a little bit stagnant. And if we just hang our hat on the capability model and don't work in a kind of adaptive way in how we develop our people, and that's not to say we bend like bamboo in the wind either, but we need to be adaptable and flexible in how we apply that capability model, I think. All right, so leader-led and expert-driven. So that doesn't mean there's an end in between there, but you know, how do we kind of lead? How do we get people? How do we get leaders to lead their people more effectively? How do we get leaders to take on more accountability for developing their people? So this goes back to, you know, our point before. People like us can come in and run some formal training, and you know, that's often an effective way to do it, but it's not the only way. You know, how do the leaders of the teams take accountability for developing people? So you can have the expert-driven learning, which is, I guess, what we do, but then how do you get the managers to step up more effectively? Again, there's nothing worse than, you know, talking with a group of, let's say, high potential middle managers, and you know, having a fantastic kind of program. It goes over, let's say, a year, and I normally do a check-in when they come back in. How are things gone? Have you had a conversation with your manager? What's the level of support? And I'm still constantly surprised by the level of support that people who are in a formal training program don't get from their manager. Oh, they're too busy to have that conversation with me, or they said, oh, whatever you want to do is fine. You know, for me, I often say that managers should feel like they're almost part of the program. You know, that's how intimately involved in the program they should be. So I don't know what you think about that, Christopher.
Yeah, I always push people coming out of an intervention with me to actually be accountable for bringing their manager along for the ride if they weren't already, and going back and sharing the top learnings from the day or the few days we were together, and then having a discussion about what they're going to do together to continue that over the next X number of days or weeks. But at the same time, I think we need to be building leaders into learning and development offerings whenever we can. And so I know we'll talk about one opportunity to do that later in the call, but even in a formal face-to-face setting, building in a portion of the day where a leader or a group of leaders in a panel or a pair can come in and actually take over a bit of
Yeah.
content and talk about how it applies in their context, I think is all
Great.
the more beneficial.
I hadn't thought about talking about this, but I've got a nice little exercise based on some research around how do you move people, effectively from that 10% to the 20 to the 70, and people do a bit of a card sort as to who is the most critical person or people in the kind of that person's life in terms of being able to apply the learning, and it includes the facilitator slash coach, the actual learner themselves, and the manager. And without fail, most people put themselves as number one, the facilitator is number two, and then their manager is number three, whereas actually the research says the opposite. The most important person is the manager in terms of helping that person apply the learning. It's not even the learner, it's the manager and the context they provide. And this might be a bit of a dent to our ego, but the facilitator, consultant, coach is number three in importance. So that,
Yeah, I
something we
know
need to think about.
we can debunk the numbers all we want, but I think the least self-serving thing a facilitator can do is bring up the 70-20-10 model, and I used to do it at the start of every session because instantly they should know that the manager is going to have potentially double the impact that I would ever have as a facilitator. So I
Exactly.
think it's really
Exactly.
important to remember.
Yeah, great. Number four, real world and practical, which we've kind of touched on, that it needs to actually be relevant for people's jobs or future jobs, so the ones we're preparing people for. And I know that really sounds obvious, but often people, I notice, some development programs get wheeled out and they're very generic, and they really might make people feel better about themselves in the short term, but actually, can they apply those skills? So I guess, I don't know, Christopher, I think you and I are quite pragmatic in this regard, that yes, that doesn't stop us from doing the deeper inner work that is required of leadership. So I'm not saying it just needs to be about skills, because we do fundamentally need people to think about themselves and their purpose and those deeper kind of questions, and it needs to be then translatable to the real world. So transfer of learning, I think we've talked a lot about that. That is primary. You have to have a critical eye on that. Supports both the leader and learner. So I think, I often, this is an old saying, but the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so I think, how we harvest and harness the energy and the goodwill of managers to be able to get them to teach, or at least have conversations with people, is really critical. Mechanisms to support accountability. So I mentioned the word scaffolding before. How do we support people, to actually apply the learning? And at best, it's got to be neutral. But at worst, what I see sometimes is that it's really hard for people to re-enter back into their roles, and then for the manager to say, "Oh, you haven't got time for that rubbish," or that touchy-feely stuff. I mean, that just makes my skin crawl when I hear that. The manager's got to give people the space, and people have got to set up their own levels of accountability to make sure they do it and change the behaviours in the right areas. It doesn't break the bank, so budget is important. As a large organisation in Australia, and I are having a conversation about trying to really reshape their L&D offering internally, and being cost effective is really important, despite this being a multi-billion-dollar organisation. It doesn't matter whether you have a budget of $10,000 or $10 million. We have to be mindful of the cost of training as well. Focus is on the pathway to get there. This has become a real passion for me, Christopher, in the last few years, that I kind of think like we often overinvest in goals and underinvest in the pathway to get there. And so what are the habits and practices that we're going to set up as a result of the development to really help us achieve the goal, rather than having a bright, shiny goal and then only thinking about it once a month? It doesn't kind of work. So the pathways are really important, I think. And then finally, how do we reinforce and reward people for exhibiting the right behaviour? So what do you think? I know you've seen these top 10, of course, and you contributed to these top 10. What do you think of those there? Any other comments?
Yeah, no, I think I just touching back on number 9. I think the idea of valuing the journey and not just the end state is incredibly important. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've done a lot of work in my career with young professionals, and they obviously are very interested in setting goals and moving towards a really exciting future. And I'm the first person to say that that is a really fabulous place to be. We want to manifest things. We want to really set and create visions that excite us and create passion within us. And we also have to understand how to break that down. If we set a 5-year goal, we should understand what we have to do this week to move towards that, and not make it something, as you said, just once a month or once every 6 months we can reevaluate. So I think it's very important to understand, what am I doing in each and every opportunity I find myself in, whether that's a project or a manager that might be really difficult for me to work with. How is that all leading to me achieving that 10-year vision or 5-year goal, whatever it might be?
Yeah, that's great. So every moment isn't a moment for development, really, or at least to think about developing oneself and team members, and how do we practice different behaviours in that moment. I think it's so critical.
Yeah, and that can be a tiring endeavour, but an important one, as you and I both know.
Yeah, that's right. So we talked at the start of this webinar that we were going to introduce this the notion of actionable conversations and some of the principles behind it, and I think it's just so aligned with contemporary, really leading edge thinking, which is why I got on board a couple of years ago, and I'm super excited about what this platform has to offer and the principles that sit behind it. Not as a panacea, but as a very important part of the puzzle that picks up a whole lot of the things we've been talking about. Now, both of what we see is going wrong with learning and development, and what we see as the future trends in learning and development. So, I might get you to talk through the folks on the webinar around some of the ideas behind Actionable.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and one of the reasons that I really got drawn into what Actionable is doing in the learning space is really that pinnacle I spoke to earlier around sustaining learning in a really powerful way, but also even potentially more importantly, measuring learning in a way that's going to be valuable to not only the individual and their manager, but hopefully the organization as a whole, to start thinking about that idea of return on investment. So Actionable actually started by looking at business books, so popular business books that had something to offer people, but again, very hard to understand how it applies to you at an individual level. So started off by really trying to boil down those business books into a digestible concept or model and offer that to individuals around the world. That's progressed to include technology, and you'll see, I guess, over the course of the next few minutes how that plays out. But at a very simple level, it's about allowing people to set a commitment that they can make for themselves. No one's forcing that upon them. Giving them an opportunity to set a commitment that could be related to a mindset shift. It could be a new skill they want to work on, or a relationship based skill that they really want to think about, and give them 30 days to make a bit of a micro behavior change, not to get too buzzwordy, but really think about, how am I, day to day focusing on something that is going to lead towards a behavior change in a really positive way. The science behind behavior change really speaks to allowing people to really own that experience and really hold themselves accountable. So this is something that really allows that to happen. And they always have the option to write their own commitment if one of the ones that's given to them in a program doesn't suit, I guess, their mindset or where they're at currently. But we really want to empower them to set a commitment and see that through for 30 days. What that actually starts with.
Sorry, I really love that idea of micro behavior and micro learning. It picks up that notion of people don't become effective managers and leaders just by doing one big thing. It's just a whole, if you look at the kind of people who are excellent at sport or excellent in any part of the business world, they do it through micro steps, don't they? But they do 1,000 of them, where the rest of us mortals might do 100 of them. Right?
Yeah, and I think one of those. I've always loved Malcolm Gladwell's books. I get a real kick out of his writing, and he talks about the 10,000 hour rule, which again, a lot of
Yes.
people like to debunk. But I think the more time we can spend focusing on a skill that we know is going to have an impact on our success is really powerful. So
Mm.
again, buzzword aside, us changing behavior is what pretty much every learning and development professional in the world is after. It's just
Yeah.
understanding how can we build that into an organization in a way that's going to add value. So
Yeah.
when we actually think about how this actually applies to some of the things we've spoken to earlier, the 70-20-10 model really comes back into play where that 10% might be classroom-based learning, and again, you and I see a place for that in nearly every organization. There is a time and space for that, but we have to pair that with something that's more relationship-based, and then also
Mm.
something that's more experience-based. So the actionable methodology is really based around three key concepts, and that is conversation, action, and insight. So when we think about conversation, this is actually in our context a leader-led conversation that could be about a piece of content, but much more importantly, it's about how it applies in the context
Mm.
that finds themselves. So
Yeah.
it's 5 minutes of content typically is the approach. So what's this 5 minutes of content look like? Let's talk about it. But much more importantly, let's spend the majority of our hour-long conversation
Mm.
talking about so what. So what does this mean to us as a team and for me as an individual? And then
Yeah.
finally, the result of that conversation is me saying, now what? So what am I doing now with this information? And that is setting a commitment that I will see through for 30 days. And I will check in on kind of how that micro behavior change is going so that the insight, the final piece of the conversation action insight, gives the manager an opportunity to coach me along the way because they're seeing how I'm progressing, but also gives the organization a really clear idea of how this greater body of individuals is making behavior change related to a certain piece of content that we've
Mm.
seen as important to them. So
I'm
it's
just seeing a
a
comment.
interesting
Sorry,
methodology.
Christopher.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just seeing a comment here from Josh, who's talking about, so if it's 5 minutes of content, what do you talk about for the other 55 minutes? But I think you're probably sending a shudder through, some people who are so used to having so much content dumped on them that what we're really talking about here is context-based learning rather than content. I think that's the key, isn't it? And that's why this is so different, why it's so powerful.
Yeah, and when we think about back to that top 10, again, it has to meet them where they are. It has to be context rich. And, this is something that if there's 5 minutes of what and 55 minutes of so what and now what, that's a really powerful place to be as a collective
Indeed.
group of people. So,
Yeah.
in a small environment, you're not going to have people hiding from the facilitator in the back of a 25-person room. This is typically that kind of 6 to 8, maybe 10 people having a conversation
Yeah.
and really understanding what the
Yeah.
context is for them.
Yeah.
So
Great.
that's a
Thank you.
great comment from Josh. So where we actually go, and I might just skip over that slide for a moment and come to why actionable conversations. What we also looked at is it's really important for the leader to gain development right alongside the participants in a program. And I guess one of the big value adds for me that isn't always apparent is the leader in actionable conversations really has a fabulous chance to by no means are they expected to be a professional facilitator. It's really a casual conversation. So any manager should technically be able to have a conversation with their team, but it's much more about helping them along the way in terms of coaching and mentoring a group of individuals. And
Yeah.
that could be in the conversation itself, where they're given notes and an approach to that conversation. But much more importantly, it's after the fact what kind of data they're being provided with and prompts to maybe check in with a person who hasn't been feeling very good about their commitment they set, or
Mm.
someone who's
Mm.
struggling to hold themselves accountable in a certain way. So it's
Mm.
really bringing that leader along for the ride, and really increasing the relationship and engagement across the team as a whole.
Yeah, gold.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle. As we said at the start, this is not a one size fits all or a cure all for
No.
all of our L&D problems, but something that pairs really beautifully with some of the other offerings that we see as incredibly important in the L&D space. So again, over the month, you might have multiple check-ins. You might have a leader checking in along the way as well. And what we haven't talked about too much, or I haven't talked about since I started talking about Actionable, is the role of an accountability buddy. So we do have an accountability buddy built into the kind of 30-day process, where if I really find a commitment that I'm going to struggle with, and I see that at the outset, I can actually select somebody to help hold me accountable outside of just my manager. So it's a really good tool to, again, make sure that that loop is being closed. How many of us have set New Year's resolutions, and come February 15, we've forgotten all about it? So the idea is to have someone else really bring us along for that ride and help hold us accountable.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, Christopher, the accountability buddy, we've used that for a number of years, and it may not be a particularly new idea, but it's one of many things that really make this program different.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, when we look at behavioral science and behavior change, and the role of having accountability built into every phase of the process is really important. And having a kind of a three-pronged approach, if you will, of I'm holding myself accountable. My manager is going to support me along the way and be prompted to do so when necessary. But there's also someone who I can select, whether that's within my team or even outside of my organization, to be that final check and balance. I think is a really nice piece. So this slide is really just to give people some insight on the webinar, and people who are watching the recording later, an idea of what the check-in process is. It's literally 2 clicks where I can click in via email or SMS, depending on my preference. And it's just essentially an NPS score for those who are familiar with the Net Promoter Score. But it's just a red light, yellow light, green light system. So it's a 0 to 10. How am I feeling about my commitment today? And if I want to write any free text comments, that can add some context again to my manager that might see this along the way. So again, really straightforward and a way to just keep it front of mind. And I think that's the biggest piece for me is I don't mind if I'm scoring high or low. I'm keeping something front of mind for somebody that will create a behavior change and potentially a new habit over a 30-day period.
Yeah, absolutely. So powerful.
Yeah, and on the back end, a huge number of metrics that are made available to the manager and the organization in terms of how is this cohort going in terms of changing behavior, how many check-ins are happening, what's the engagement like, and how many at the end of that 30 days are feeling like a new habit's been formed, and what has potentially aided that and what's gotten in the way of that. And so I think it's a really clear way of saying, you know what, we had a bit of a lag this month, but it was the end of the financial year, and we had a bit on in terms of projects, so that makes sense. So it's taking the focus away from lagging indicators like employee surveys, which are fabulous, but they could look at what happened 6 months ago, to what's happening currently day to day in my organization, and how can I use that leading indicator as a really clear way forward.
It's such a different way to think about it, isn't it? And I know there's in the health and wellness area, there's different organisations have been using different software for a few years now, where, for example, people sit down at their desk and it's almost like a mood meter. How am I feeling today? What's my level of wellness like? My level of energy? And they check in every day. I'm not sure it's really taken off. There's certainly some organisations who are using it, but again, this is another mechanism we can use as a leading indicator, as you suggest, which gives people, managers, real-time access to how people are travelling, how they're feeling about their goals and being in the team, really. Because if something's kind of taken a plummet, if someone's been a 7 or 8 or a 9, out of 10, I'm going really well, and suddenly I've got a couple of days where I'm a 2. We can just go over and just, tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, is everything okay?
Yeah, and again, it's really clearly tied to engagement. How much I feel invested in from an L&D perspective will keep me in my role, and it can lead to me leaving if I don't feel like someone's investing in me. So again, not that this platform is a way of having someone feel like you're investing in them, but I think it's a way of really engaging with them in a conversation that has them feeling more supported in a way that some L&D offerings alone can't do. So I think that, again, it's pairing it in a way.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, just sorry, butting in there, it also gives the manager some structure, doesn't it? Because not all managers / leaders know how to do that, or are confident or capable of actually doing that. But this actually gives managers actually something to check in with their people about, something very practical, looking through the lens of a business book, as you said, or training which is already happening, and being able to check in with people, and it gives them the structure and a process to do that as well, which I think is another fantastic kind of value add that can really support managers to be even more effective.
Yeah, I totally agree. So when we actually, round this out again, it's coming back to that idea of conversation, action, and insights, and that is a daily data point off the back end that can look at the engagement, the leader impact, who are some of the influencers across the organization, and really can lead to much more strategic conversations about where the organization needs to go from an L&D perspective. Not just what's the next conversation we need to have, but what do we need to do more broadly in our organization? Does leader development really address some of the issues we're seeing in the data? Does the offering from an e-learning perspective give people enough of a self-driven development from a self-driven development standpoint? Whatever that conversation needs to be from a strategic level, I think is something that can come out of this data. Again, that question and that constant struggle with return on investment is something that I think is clearly tied to a measure of behavior change. So we're able to see through those highly engaged teams, they have higher profitability and they hit higher customer metrics. Some of the stats along the bottom of this slide, I think, really speak to we need to really focus on relationships and engagement as part of our L&D offering. And that's one of the pieces that, again, I go back to some of the organizations I've consulted with and have looked at building in an e-learning solution as their L&D solution. And it's a part of it in a lot of cases and a good part. But I think we also need to understand the power and benefit of relationships. That's
Absolutely.
something that I think Actionable does in a really wonderful way, whilst also being a affordable option, which I know we can speak to in a moment, but also leader-led, very context-rich. I think the top 10 is gaining a lot of tick marks when I go through it, and that's one of the biggest pieces that attracted me to Actionable in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. That's a great summary, and I think it does tick a lot of the boxes in terms of that top 10 and where we see learning and development going in the future and picking up some of the latest trends. And again, this is, we're not suggesting this is a panacea. This is probably one of part of the puzzle, for organisations who are out there listening or watch the recording. And just to be clear, so it can be standalone where people have a conversation with their own team through the lens of a popular business book, and that can kind of be intact and by itself, or we can use the commitment engine as part of a different program. So it could be a program run by, I don't know, a university or an internal trainer run something, and then you want to, give people the extra benefit of the extra support, where we can just have the commitment engine. That would be a fair assessment of its flexibility in terms of how you use the platform.
Yeah, again, when we look at that conversation, action, and insight, we have essentially broken away the commitment engine to be bolted on to any intervention, whether that be, again, a webinar like this or a live session in any context. So the opportunities are really endless. That conversation in a lot of the curated content is based on an idea or a concept from a business book. But that conversation can also be very client specific and take the form of really taking a deep dive into some of the strategic priorities of an organization to scale some of that learning down and get really clear measures on how well the uptake, I guess the employees are really taking that up at a strategic level.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's fantastic. Thank you, Christopher. We've probably got time for just a couple of questions, and we do have a special offer today for people. Sounds like, and we've had some steak knives with that as well. But we do want to reward people for being on the webinar, and I mean, it's a cost-effective solution anyway. In fact, there's a question here from Alice about how much does all this cost? It sounds expensive. Would you mind perhaps addressing that as the first question? We'll probably have time for 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question from Alice, and to me that's one of the pieces. And again, I like the joke about the steak knives because by no means I'm not a salesperson, nor do I plan to be in the future. But I think the nice thing, I guess the aspect of pricing that has really made sense to me, coming from another L&D based provider. And joining Actionable is that this is something that is affordable. And for a team to go through this experience, from having a conversation, going through 30 days of having that commitment be measured, and the manager being supported with some prompts along the way in terms of coaching conversations and support that's needed, and then getting the really rich report off the back end. That's $350. So that's not per person. That's for the team over a 30-day period to go through that experience end to end. So that involves a really nice upskilling of the leader to feel comfortable and confident having that conversation, and the report off the back end. So again, if you have a team of 8 people, we're looking at a really affordable option to run a month of learning and have that be measured and sustained along the way. So a really great question from Alice, though.
Yeah, and it can be scaled up, right? So the other question here from Jonathan is about subscription versus some other kind of model. So is it a subscription model? We know it's not. Would you mind addressing that one as well?
Yeah, so it's something that definitely is not a subscription model. It's something that, as I said, it's credit based, which is a new one for me from a provider standpoint. But it's really just you use a credit to have a conversation and gain the measurement and sustainment that comes along with that. To scale that up, there is a bit of an economies of scale. So for large organizations, the price per conversation, quote unquote, can go down slightly, but it's definitely not a subscription model. So if you don't use it, in Australia we are very good at taking December and January off for the most part, in a lot of industries, and so for those 2 months you're definitely not paying for anything you're not using. So
great,
you pay for what you get. It's a good model.
Yeah, it's something I really love about the model as well. Versus subscription, which has its benefits, but I love the flexibility of actually having credits as well, and being able to scale up really quickly. It's the time required from someone like myself in the background is quite minimal, but we're always there to support the leader and the team as well, and answer any questions they might have. But for me, this is about being leader-led, organisational-driven learning and development, not being consultant-driven. I think that's really important.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that, as much as it is leader-led and organizationally driven, which I totally agree with from start to finish, it also is very low touch in terms of time investment. I think for a lot of organizations that have implemented it really successfully, they've potentially replaced a portion of the team meetings that already exist in their calendar with a 60-minute actionable conversation. They're still gaining some real value and diving into to something that's really current for them, but they also are really able to I guess not invest a ton of time. That doesn't take a lot of management or support in terms of the background on the organization side of things. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Unfortunately, we haven't got any more time for questions, but I just, maybe as a magic fairy, went through the next slide, Christopher, or was that you?
Yeah.
I just sort of flick up.
That was me.
That was you. Okay. You really want that offer out there, right? You're so excited about it. You just want people to see it. So here it is. There we go. So look, we would like to offer this to people who are listening today and also watching the recording, and we'll let you know how to make yourself or take advantage of these offers. But basically, the 3-month package, which we believe really gives people a great opportunity to experience 3 months worth of conversations. You get support from someone like myself or Christopher. In that you get the setup, you get the leader notes. Sometimes they have explanatory videos as well. The commitment engine, all of that is part of that. So for 3 months of development for one team, we believe it's a great return on investment. And then the other packages are just different. So 3-month package with plus coaching would be with someone like myself for an hour, coaching plus what you get in package 1. And then package 3 is just a toe in the water, try before you buy, single session, which means a whole month, includes setup and a brief coaching session. So we think people will get the best, have the best opportunity to really experience the power of the platform. Christopher.
Yeah, and I think that it's one of those things, one of those experiences that until you try it, it's hard to conceptually understand exactly where it's going to fit and how it's going to supplement or really complement other initiatives you have in place. So it's a fabulous, I guess, piece to be able to really understand and get into it with these offers.
Yeah, and I know that the teams that have actually utilised this, whether being Australia or other organisations, have reported whole range of benefits like higher levels of engagement. People actually working on real kind of team or business issues. Like the benefits have been quite amazing for me. So I just highly recommend people give it a try and experience it for yourself, as you're saying, Christopher. And then finally, just as a way to make this kind of evergreen, so you can always find the kind of latest offers and what have you, is to go to the website. So theleadershipsphere.com.au, and then click on programs and services, which is here, and then that will bring up Actionable Conversations. Because once we put this recording in different places, sometimes you might be asked for a discount code. So this code, I recommend you write that down. Webinar 1 AC 2017. So if you are asked for that code to receive a further discount, please put that in at that particular time. But really love to make this offer to people who are listening today, and we'd love you to get in touch with us. So in terms of that, if you Google the Leadership Sphere, we'll certainly come up in the top 10 in Google results. So there's a national number there, and we've got an email address there as well. So that's about it, I think. Thank you very much, Christopher. Is there any kind of final comments before we sign off? I think it's been awesome. I've really appreciated your insight and your experience around Actionable and the L&D field particularly. And I think it's such an exciting area going forward. and there's so much opportunity here for organisations when they do it well. That's my personal opinion. So, yeah, any final comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, just really happy to be a part of it. Thank you for inviting me to join you. And yeah, I think the big piece for me is just really understanding how to build out that full offering that's really going to, I guess, have those different pieces complementing one another, but also leading to, I guess, the point that you really need in your organization. So what is the pain point, and how is your L&D offering really speaking to that pain point? And I think that that to me is really crucial, and not just ticking a box or putting something in place because you think it sounds flashy and new. That's not the intent of special offers, but really understanding what's going to add value and lead to better results as a whole.
Yeah. So this is part of an education series. We really want to add a huge amount of value to people who listen, or people who were on the webinar today, but also will listen to the recording. We'll have other educational series webinars coming up as well. We'll be interviewing a whole lot of really great people like Christopher. This just happens to have Actionable attached to it, but in other educational series we'll be talking about a whole lot of really relevant thinking and trends around leadership and team development. So hope you can join us again, and we will see you then. Bye for now. See you, Christopher.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.